Hi, Chris. So, Cris Rowan is a pediatric occupational therapist. She's a biologist, an international speaker, and author of the book Virtual Child. She's an expert on the impact of technology on human development, behavior, and productivity. She's a frequent guest on radio, TV, and documentaries. Her Reconnect Webinars program offers workshops, consultation, and training and webinars to help people balance healthy activities and technology. Her information is research evidenced, and the research can be found on her fact sheet on her site. So welcome, Cris.
Thank you.
Let's just jump right in. And I think we should start with the very basics, which is, what do kids need to grow and succeed from a physical point of view?
So, growing a child is kind of like building a house, and it's really all about the foundation. So, the foundation for child development and learning is that they really need to acquire four critical factors, and the more the better, the younger, right? So, those four factors are movement, touch, human connection, and nature. And this is a little graphic that kind of shows how, when kids engage in those four critical factors down here in the green, what that does is it activates different systems. So the parasympathetic system, the vestibular proprioceptive, I know these are all like big words, but it actually activates certain systems in the body and the brain to help the child to feel secure and regulated, to feel strong and coordinated, and to really be able to develop optimally and be able to learn. So when our children engage in these four critical factors, they become sustainable, and they go on and they produce progeny, and they get jobs, and they can have healthy relationships, and basically be physically healthy and happy, right? So when kids are using screens, they're not engaging in any of those four critical factors. They're not moving, they're sedentary, right? They're isolated from other people. They're actually, I'm going through the second graphic here, which is called virtual futures. So with all this screen use, they're sedentary, they're isolated, they're overstimulated. This is a big one. And we're really neglecting them. So when we're on our screens, we're neglecting our kids. So that creates a whole host of problems. So we're seeing a rise in developmental delay, obesity, we're seeing sleep deprivation, we're seeing mental illness like through the roof. That's epidemic. Depression, anxiety, self-harm, and suicide are major concerns for our kids. So they're not physically happy or healthy. They're not mentally, socially. We're seeing social phobias, all kinds of problems socially. And they're not able to learn. They have attention deficit. So we're just seeing a whole host of problems that really result then in unsustainability. We have kids who have trouble getting jobs, have trouble with relationships, and really are not healthy and happy. So the bottom line is, the ways in which we are raising and educating our kids with screens are not sustainable, and we need to change.
Yeah. And it seems like, to me, just based on the things I know about play, for example, right? I mean, is that kind of what we're talking about with those four principles that you talked about? Lots of play, right?
Outdoor play.
Real life outdoor play.
I have a bumper sticker that says go play outside.
Yeah.
And if our children just went outside to play, back to here, our building foundations, they're moving, they're playing with each other. So they're touching and being touched. They're in connection with each other. They're getting that human connection and attachment, and they're out in nature. So all of those four critical factors actually will create like a child who really does well in school and physically as well.
Yeah, so it doesn't have to sound complicated, right? It could just be, as if parents had to keep one thing in mind, that could be a really important tool, is just remember, let your kids play, right? And let
Well,
them play outside.
yeah, and I practice a concept I've developed called balanced technology management, right?
Hmm.
So what we really need to be doing is balancing healthy activity with screens, right? So if we really focus on increasing healthy activity, screen use automatically by default goes down,
Yeah.
right? So focusing on screen reduction is never very palatable by parents or teachers, right? It's just like, oh, okay, we got to reduce our use of screens. Way easier to go, hey, we need to increase our engagement in healthy activity. What can we do that's movement based, touch based, connection, human connection based, or nature based to displace the screens? And that's super, super important. Is if you tell a child they can't use the screen, or an adult,
Yeah.
for they have to go down to the recommended guidelines of 2 hours a day, they're going to be like, and this is what kids say to me, well, what am I going to do? Like,
Yeah.
what am I going to do? Right. So we really want to focus on what are they going to do?
Yeah.
And there's tons of stuff, right? But they
Yeah.
don't know. Kids who are really screen centric don't know what else to do other than
Yeah.
screen.
That is a good positive way to look at it, though. Instead of saying you can't do this, here's what all the things you can do that are healthy, and finding that balance. So speaking of content, which we know, this is just it's not that screens are bad, right? There's mindful, mindless content, right? As you talk about in your work. So can you explain the difference and how it relates to childhood brain development?
So I want to do a little bit of neuroanatomy and neurophysiology, but I'll keep it simple. So when an infant is born, think of their brain like a map, like a road map. So there's roads everywhere, right? And there's big roads like highways, and there's little feeder roads in between the highways, right? So when the infant's born, all those big roads are in place. So there are neurons going to every area of the whole brain, right when they're born. Now, what happens during growth and development to the brain is two processes. And it's really important to understand those two processes if you're going to understand the impact of screens on brain and body development. So one of them is pruning. So by the time a child is born and to the point where they die, 2/3 of those great big roads, the highways, are going to be pruned. And the reason the brain does this is it wants to get more efficient. So it kind of goes, oh, well, we've got two big roads to the frontal lobes, but they're not using this one. So we'll just kind of cut that one. Oh my gosh, they're not using this one over here. We're going to cut that too. And suddenly we have no roads that go up to the front of the brain. Front of the brain is known for our executive function, memory, concentration, impulse control, big picture thinking, critical thinking. So we don't want to lose frontal lobe. We've evolved as humans to occupy the frontal lobe, and what we're seeing in the research is that kids who overuse screens are actually pruning tracts to their frontal lobes. So
Mm-hmm.
this is not good. And that's why we're seeing a lot of kids with behavior issues, aggression. They have no impulse control. They can't remember anything. They're not motivated. I don't want to do that. So when we think of media content, we have mindful content that
Mm-hmm.
builds the brain, and we have mindless content that actually doesn't activate the brain at all.
Yeah.
So if we want to keep those big roads, the big tracts and neurons going to the frontal lobes, the frontal cortex, we want to use mindful content. Okay, so
Mm-hmm.
that's something that makes the kids think. That's like nature programs, sports programs. You're watching sports and you're like, why did the ref do that? And you can see the kids are actually thinking, they're interacting with each other. Certainly educational content, so news. So there's a lot of things that make us think.
Yeah.
Now, the mindless content, the stuff that is actually causing the deterioration of our frontal lobes, is stuff that we don't have to think about. So video games, very stimulus response.
Yeah.
There's just no time. It's going so fast for the message to go from the visual cortex to the frontal cortex, right? So video games, obviously, social media, texting is pretty mindless. pornography, very mindless. You're not thinking at all. So most of the entertainment-based content is mindless and is going to be causing deterioration in the frontal lobes of your children.
Yeah. And I'm sure I'm not the first person to use this metaphor, but I always tell my kids, there's healthy content and then there's sugar content, right? If you kind of equate it to that, I think everybody can understand. It's not that you don't ever have sugar, right? But maybe you limit that a little bit more over broccoli, So I don't know how you feel about that metaphor, but that reminds me of what you're saying.
Yes, and it's great to come up with those things like broccoli and candy, or you know, I have when I do tech talks in schools for kids, I have and a kid gave me this idea. I get my best ideas from kids, but I've got a big jar with a whole bunch of rubber bands in it, showing, and it has a big picture of a brain on it, and
Mm-hmm.
the rubber bands are supposed to be the neurons, right? And then I have a little jar with only one rubber band in it and a very tiny brain on it. And so
Yeah.
when we go through and we talk about content, and we're trying to determine, is this mindless or mindful, I kind of use these little jars to kind of show the kids,
Yeah.
and it seems to work. Yeah.
Yeah, I think those metaphors are useful, those ones that they can understand. Okay, and I think you touched on this a little bit, but let's broaden out to modern screen technology, right? How do you think modern screen technology is affecting kids developing neurological systems? So you talked about the prefrontal cortex already, but is there anything you would add to that conversation?
Yeah, it's hugely impacting an area of growing concern, in that when kids are watching content
Mm-hmm.
that is exciting, like video games, or even when I have a text come in on my phone, what happens is the brain releases a neurotransmitter called dopamine.
Yeah.
And that is a really exciting, neurotransmitter. It makes us very excited and very curious. And the other thing that happens is the adrenal glands release adrenaline.
Mm-hmm.
So we have two different chemicals in our body and brains that are now in heightened levels. And what that does is it increases the blood pressure in the heart, and the heart rate. And so what we're seeing with kids who like game out at night, or prolonged use of gaming over a weekend, is hypertensive cardiovascular systems. Now, this
Mm-hmm.
is not good at all in children. So we have this sympathetic nervous system that releases adrenaline for a reason. We have it so that we can have these high adrenaline states and like run away from a lion or a bear that's chasing us. But we don't want to be running away from something, which is what you're doing in video games, right? You're
Yeah.
running away from things and you're hitting things and punching things. And to be in these heightened states of adrenaline and dopamine are really, really hard on the body. So increased risk for anything cardiovascular, so stroke, heart attack. The other thing that happens when kids sit for long periods is blood pools in their legs and clots form. And again, problems, when they get to the heart and when they get to the brain with heart attack and stroke. So there's so much going on
Mm-hmm.
with sedentary, isolated, overstimulated, and neglected kids.
Mm-hmm.
They're that affects so many systems: their physical systems, their emotional systems, their social systems, their cognitive systems, and their mental status. Those are kind of the five big ones that we're seeing huge impact and huge problems.
Yeah, I mean, I think in our work we talk a lot about the brain, but I think what you're saying is goes back to the mind-body connection, right? Like, things that are happening in our brains can ultimately affect our bodies as well. And I'm not sure. It sounds a little scary, right? To maybe think of, it's not that your child's gonna have a heart attack, right? But it's that it's triggering these physiological events, right, in their bodies that are maybe similar to that. Is that a good way of explaining that? Or
Well, let's talk about, because it's all about, we've talked about content. It's all about
Mhm.
content, duration. So
Yeah.
how long kids are at it, and early use.
Yeah.
So children that are starting to do gaming, say,
Hmm.
we'll focus on that, or social media early,
Yeah.
when their neurological systems are still developing, like between 0 and 2, the brain triples in size between 0 and 2 years, right? So we want to do lots of this kind of movement, touch, human connection, nature, and no screens. And that's what our pediatricians are saying. Nothing 0 to 2, only an hour a day, 3 to 5 years, and 2 hours a day, 6 to 12 years. Now that doesn't sound like very much, right? But if we start increasing healthy activity, it's gonna be a whole lot easier to reach those targets.
Hmm.
So we really want to try to limit the duration and limit the early use. So the
Hmm.
problems I talked about, the cardiovascular problems, are kids who've had early use, right? And their whole systems are changing. Their brains totally wired differently than a brain of a child who had an enriched environment of lots of the critical factors. So
Yeah.
we want to watch and stick within those guidelines for early usage and durations. So it's also, I found in the research that the shorter durations more frequently are better than longer durations. So let's say you have a 3-year-old and they're going to watch a movie. Give them 20 minutes and 20 minutes and then 20 minutes, and you stay under the hour, right? But what happens often is kids get bored. They start getting dozy at about that 20-minute mark, right? They start just kind of zoning out. So if we can get them off at the 20-minute mark before they start getting into that kind of dead brain state, then they're happier, and oftentimes they won't ask for the next 20 minutes, right?
Yeah.
And then you don't get the last 20 minutes either, and you've got them down to 20 minutes suddenly.
Yeah, that's interesting. The attention span is point as well. I did notice when my kids were younger, and I read up on this. A lot of the programming, the good programming, the healthy broccoli programming, is usually in shorter durations for the younger kids, and that makes a lot of sense based on what you're saying. It's healthier, but it's also just more consistent with their attention span abilities for that age. So that makes a lot of sense. So speaking of attention, which is, I think, a big, big part of our societal challenge with technology, right? Has kids' ability to pay attention declined over time? You've been doing this work a long time. And why do you
Absolutely.
think that is?
Absolutely, because we're pruning tracts of the frontal lobe. So the
Mm-hmm.
frontal lobe is, again, our executive function area, and it controls like everything a teacher needs in a child to be able to teach to them so they can learn, is in the frontal lobe. So when we're pruning tracts of frontal lobe, we are going to see attention deficit. We're going to see kids who just can't pay attention. And if you look at the speed with which media is being presented today, it's super rapid. And again, back to this overstimulation factor. And just go watch an old movie. When Mission Impossible came out, I thought, oh, I'm going to go see the old one, right? And I was so worrying. I made it like 20 minutes, right? Because it was so slow. Now everything's super fast and super intense, or the other word for that is potent, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's to the brain, it's getting so much more stimulation.
Yeah.
So we really are having a lot of trouble, like, adapting to that and coping with it, and attention deficit is the result.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so true. And then I think you touched on this a little bit, but uh, is playing on screens, right? Connecting on screens. So I think, people do argue, well, if my child is online playing Roblox, they're chatting with their friends or they're texting with their friends. Isn't that the same? They're being social. So is it comparable to the real world?
So social
Loaded question.
media is not social. And all the studies are pointing that way. Jean Twenge is probably one of the most prolific researchers. She has a TED Talk, so it's TWENGE, on social media. And what we're seeing is kids are getting more anxious, more depressed. There's more self harm, and there's more suicide ideation and actual suicide because of social media. So let's unpack that a bit and look at, well, what's going on there? And I kind of say, you're looking for love in all the wrong places, right? You're not really getting enough with a text, right? And so let's say yeah, I had a fight with my mom, and I want to get some consolation from my friends. I might text, oh, I had a fight with my mom, and then somebody might text back and say, oh, you know I mean, it's just like there's no depth
Hmm.
in social media. It's all breadth. Oh, I've got 300 friends and da da da, but you're not getting anything meaningful. You're not getting purposeful content that is soothing to the soul, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
So while they may be chatting, they're not chatting about anything in depth. It's like skating on the surface of the ice, right? You're
Yeah.
not going down to get what you need to grow and succeed. You just keep looking, scrolling, looking for that thing, whatever it is that you need, and not finding it, and it fuels the addiction, right?
Hmm.
Because you just are not getting what you need. Like the opposite of addiction is connection, human connection,
Yeah.
or attachment, right?
Yeah.
So kids and teens that are not getting enough parental attention and attachment, forming solid attachments with their parents, will go out and seek their peers, right?
Hmm.
And through social media. And so what we're seeing is less of the asking the teacher, asking the parent for advice, and more of the going online and chatting with your friends or googling it. And so we're really seeing kids who are just not informed on what they need to be to grow and be independent in
Yeah.
life.
Yeah. A couple things came to mind. And one is I know that just as a social media marketer of so many years, and all the research that I've read, isolation is one of the words that is used when people talk about social media is actually more isolating than connecting in so many ways, and I think you touched on that. So that was one of the things that came to mind as you were speaking. So I don't know if you had any other insights
Yeah,
on that
like
as well.
humans are pack animals. Like
Yeah.
we are comfortable in our pack, and we don't do very well when we're separated from our pack.
Yeah.
So for kids, the pack is their peers at school, right? And the family. Those are
Yeah.
their two packs. And like there's so much that happens in a face-to-face
Hmm.
interaction in the brain. Like the brain releases oxytocin, which
Yep.
actually helps us to connect even better with each other. That doesn't happen on a screen.
Yep.
So empathy, we're seeing a decline in empathy and a decline in kids' ability to feel comfortable in social situations because they're not interacting, right?
Yeah.
And that might be fine. If down the road we all end up just curled up in a closet somewhere with our device and an IV stuck in our arm, and but that isn't what we want for our kids. We want for our kids to grow up as kids, learning how to play, and building our motor and social skills and cognitive skills during play, and then to be able to go out in the world and become independent, sustainable human beings. Right? We don't want to raise them to just play video games. Like
Right.
it's
Yeah.
not gonna
Nope.
help.
Yeah. And then the nonverbal cues, right? I mean, there's also research about things like Zoom, or even what we're doing today is not the same. Being face
No.
to face, your brain is sort of struggling to, our brains are equipped to be 3D, right? And we're flattened to 2D right now. So while maybe it's a little bit better than being on the phone, it's still nothing compared to the, like you said, the chemicals and just all those nonverbal cues that you would get being in person. So,
Well, there's
yeah,
a huge thing about being in the 3D world that
yeah,
translates to literacy.
yeah,
So if we just kind of think about how, and when I say literacy, I mean like printing, reading, math,
yeah,
literacy. And so when we're running around outside, and let's say we're hanging upside down from a tree, and we're looking far and we're looking near, and we're activating our vestibular system, and hanging, so we're activating our muscles and our joints. And this is all helping us to develop the foundations for literacy. So spatial concepts, our visual motor skills are being activated, our visual memories being activated, our motor planning, which is the muscles knowing what to do to execute a movement. All those things happen in the 3D world, and they do not happen in the 2D world. So this is one of the biggest issues with school, and why we're seeing 2-year delays across the board. Everyone thinks, oh, it was COVID and they didn't get adequate instruction. Well, yes, who would dispute that? But what I'm seeing is the far too much use of screens in schools, and we're not achieving the foundations for literacy, which are actually found in outdoor play.
Yeah. Yeah. So important. Okay. So in your work, how have you seen parents' screen habits influencing attachment?
So I always say it's never the child that has the problem. I get referred kids with behavior issues predominantly. It's
Yes.
never the child that has a problem. It's the systems surrounding the child that have
Yeah.
the problem. And I see two big systems, the home system and the school system, where adults are behind their own screens. So
Mhm.
when an adult's got a screen in front of their face, that becomes an interface between the child and the adult, right? And it stops the ability of this attachment formation, which is absolutely integral. So my first step in my 10-step program of how to get your kid off screens is to get yourself off screens first.
Yeah.
So unplug yourself first and be available to your child. Put down the phone. Get some basic rules. Like if there's two people in a room, the phones go down immediately, right? I see this all the time, kids with earbuds, and the parents are trying to talk to them, and they're just like in another world, right? So when there's opportunities for communication, the phone should go away. So during dinner prep, dinner eat, dinner cleanup should all be done as a family with the phones down. That's an opportunity to connect with your children, right? In the car, no screens in the car. Again, another opportunity. When kids get into the teen years, with both my kids, the car was actually where we actually had conversations.
Yeah.
It was harder at dinner. What'd you do today? Nothing. Like restaurants, no screens, right?
Hmm.
Like those are, again, you're face to face. You've got an opportunity to connect. Maybe
Yeah.
your family holiday. So I say to carve out an hour a day, no screens, around dinner, a day a week. So maybe on Saturdays, you might kind of do a screen-free morning or a screen-free all day. So hour a day, day a week a year. So the
Hmm.
family holiday, no screens. The
Hmm.
brain needs time to reset and reorder itself. If it's wired toward high speed, it's not getting the rest that it needs.
Hmm. Yeah, those are really great tips. And a lot of what I heard is seems very relevant to maybe adolescents. But I'm sure you would agree for early childhood. I mean, beginning with babies, but through, say, preschool, kids learn so much just from you and your face and your expressions. And, that surely, I mean, I know I've seen data on this, is for sure diminished when you're distracted on your own device. So I think that's where it begins. But those tips are great for as kids get older and they start to use screens themselves.
Researchers are uncovering a term that is now being heavily researched, called virtual autism. So what they found was that a very tender age, between 9 months and 18 months, is a
Mm-hmm.
critical period for communication.
Yeah.
And if a child has lots of screens and very little parent contact, then they have a much higher incidence of autism. And the opposite is true. If they have lots of parent time and minimal screens, much lower incidence of autism.
Mm-hmm.
So autism is a social disorder. It's an inability to connect, and so the critical periods in development are need to be honored, and so the no screens to 8 to 2. There's a really important aspect to that. We want to teach them how to communicate. We want to give them again the brain patterning so that they can communicate. If we miss these critical periods, it's much harder to get it back. But surprisingly, research showing unplugging kids with autism, so getting them off screens, they go off the spectrum. They become normalized again. So you can reverse. It's not like when I say the word damage, it damages the brain. You can reverse that early, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you wait till they're 18, it's going to be way harder, right? But if you catch it now and you start, backing off of the screens now, then you can actually expect to have a normalized child.
Interesting. Okay, and I think my last question would be, and you covered this a little bit already, but what are your tips on how parents can help their kids find that balance between technology, real world experiences? I don't think anybody is saying complete abstinence, right? I mean, there needs to be a balance. These are tools. These are platforms that we need to use in our everyday life, and it's probably going to get more and more complicated over time. But what are the principles that you would say parents can use to help them find balance, help their kids find balance?
So first and foremost, focus on the increased access to healthy activities, and understand that as a parent, you need to build not only just interest in alternative activities, but build skill, confidence, and competence. Right. So if you say to your kid, okay, so we're going to start doing more healthy activity, and here I'll drop you off on the soccer pitch, and I've signed you up for soccer, and we haven't taught that child any skills, and they're not feeling very confident in trying, because this is a big thing with kids now, because they haven't been out there doing these things. They don't have any confidence, and if you don't have any confidence, you're not going to do it, and you're not going to reach competence, which is when you're getting good at something. So we really have to get out there with our kids and help them to learn these motor skills that are needed for doing like sports, or gosh, there's zillions of things like music. I have a handout for my webinars. It's called the Tech Toolkit, and in that is 100 things to do other than screens, right? It's broken into kind of 4 categories. So things you can do by yourself, things you can do with someone else, blah blah blah. So there's taking courses, there's a billion things you can do. So first of all, as parents, we have to help our kids to identify what they're interested in. What do you want to do? Is there anything you wanted to do that you want to try, like singing, maybe, joining a choir? Like every child I've worked with, we have been able to identify up to 4 to 5 interests, right? It's much harder if the kid's really screen centric, right? One of the biggest things I like is get on that bike. So we want to go outside and play. So let's dig out that bike. There's probably one in the garage somewhere. It's got flat tires and the, brakes aren't working and whatever. So let's fix that up and let's all go for a bike ride. Bike riding does require motor skill, but it's easily learned, right? So it's much less complicated than say playing soccer. So start with something easy and work your way up, but work off the child's interests first.
Yeah. I mean, just as a mom, often, you ask your kids, what do you want to do? I don't know. Right. So I think that worksheet or toolkit that you mentioned is super, super helpful. But I'll just add, as a parent too, I do think at the end of the day, especially when our kids are younger, they just want to be with us. So even just saying, you know what, we're going to go for a bike ride. Let's go, and not even ask them, do you want to go? Often works. Like once you get them going, and like you said, like you tap into those evolutionary feelings of the wind in your face and the sun and all that. I mean, they ultimately, just from my experience anyway, end up enjoying it, right? And they just want to be with you. So I don't think you can go wrong. I feel like any activity that you enjoy, you can also bring your kids in on it. That's
And
just my,
it's about quality, not quantity of time.
yeah,
So if you're a parent kind of going and you're reacting to everything we're talking about and going, "Oh, I don't have time, I don't have time."
yeah,
Like there's simple things you can do. Like, so say you pick your kids up from daycare, you've been working all day and you get home. Instead of having this kind of like everyone goes into their phone state, is give your kids like a half an hour of yourself. Say,
yeah,
I'm mom's gonna put her phone down right over there, or dad's gonna, put that thing in the desk, and we're gonna play a board game, or we're gonna play a card game, or we're gonna do you want me to read you a book? Do you want How about if we sit and the older sibling can read the younger sibling a book, but I'm going to be there and I'm going to be like helping out, and so you're going to give them 100% of you, not listening for the notifications. Turn those friggin' notifications off. That'll change your whole life if you do
yeah,
that. But really give them quality input, like you say, going for a bike ride. And what you'll find is that'll be just enough that they can separate, and maybe go color, or carry on with whatever activity you were doing, and you can have a little time to yourself, and you can start to make dinner. Get the kids in there with you making dinner. Get some stools and chairs, and get them
yeah,
chopping stuff and stirring stuff, and so you need to take breaks for yourself. Obviously, you need to look at your phone. You say you've got a home business or whatever, you can't let things go for hours and hours, right? But you can carve out half an hour, right?
yeah,
And give that to your kids. They'll love
yeah.
you for it.
I think that's anybody can manage that. Well, Cris, I really, really appreciate your time. This was you're so knowledgeable, and this was so in depth, but I think also super understandable for anyone. So thank you so much again.
You're very welcome.
Bye.
Bye bye.